Just letting you know, right at the beginning here, I'm going to criticize both sides. And it's important to remember that closing arguments are not evidence. These are arguments. The prosecution started. They set out the evidence that Jennifer Dulos is deceased and that she was murdered. In my opinion, the evidence does prove that. They set out all the evidence that it was Fotis Dulos who murdered Jennifer. I know that there can be arguments made to the contrary, but based on the evidence that we've seen, it's, again, my opinion that the state has proven this beyond a reasonable doubt. The state had to prove that Fotis had intent and that he committed an overt act. They point to the fact that he arrived early on May 22nd for the visit with the kids. They point to him and Pavel having dropped off the Tacoma at 80 Mountain Spring the night before. I agree that these things point to planning in Fotis' mind. I would add that there's a lot more that points to planning on Fotis' part. For example, he had Pavel fix the bicycle months in advance. Another example is that he showed photos of Jennifer's house to both Pavel and the tech guy at 4 Group and asked them if they thought various items in the photos could be cameras. Also, the frequency with which he had been communicating with Kent in recent months had increased significantly. I believe that Fotis planned to kill Jennifer and that he'd been planning it for a long time. Notice who knows what in these situations. Kent and Pavel are seeing and hearing this, and Pavel even went with Fotis to drop off the Tacoma. Michelle was not present for any of this. Michelle didn't see or hear any of this. While Fotis and Pavel were off dropping off the Tacoma, Michelle was with guests at Fort Jefferson showing them rugs and preparing for a dinner party. Michelle was not present for the conversation with Pavel and the tech guy. Michelle didn't know that Fotis had been at Jennifer's house on the 22nd until after Jennifer's disappearance, when Michelle overheard Fotis speaking to Jacob about it. So does the evidence show that Fotis had intent? Heck yeah. And his actions show premeditation. Is there a scintilla of evidence here to even suggest that Michelle knew this? No, nada, nothing. There is, however, some evidence that she did not know. She was angry at Fotis for lying to her, for not telling her that he was going to Jennifer's. Why would she be upset about that if she was in on it? The prosecution suggested that everyone at the dinner party was toasting the murder plan. I'm sorry, this is Cracker Jacks. Do you think that all these people, including a domestic violence counselor who knew and liked Jennifer, are really doing this? And do you think all these people knew about this plot all along and no one ever talked about it? No one ever cracked or messed up? It's Cracker Jacks. The prosecution points out that Michelle's timeline included her phone calls, but did not include the phone call to Fotis' phone from Greece. The timeline was never intended for police. It was never intended as a statement, and I think it's important to remember that. You can't treat the timeline as some sort of a statement because it is not. What Michelle put on her timeline was her phone calls, not Fotis' calls. She was using her phone to help her remember, and you can see she listed all her phone calls that she saw on her phone history. She wouldn't have been using Fotis' phone to create her timeline. And one could make the argument that if her timeline was an alibi script, we would see on there that Fotis talked to his friend in Greece. But Michelle didn't include that. One could also argue that her failure to write this on her timeline is evidence that she'd forgotten about that call. Remember, she's focused on trying to prove where she was. The prosecution points to Fotis's phone being manipulated at 6:44 a.m. Note that this was a manipulation and not a travel. If you look at this on the surface, this is troublesome. At 6:44, Fotis was already gone. So that makes this look pretty bad. That is, until you remember that in one of Michelle's interviews, the police asked her about when she went from Nicole's room into her bedroom, whether or not she saw the phone on the nightstand in the bedroom. And she said she did not. The phone was not in the bedroom by the time Michelle got up. And the prosecution left out that there was lots of movement on Fotis's phone very early in the morning before he left. I think that shows that Fotis put the phone in the office before he left so that it would be available for Kent later on. And that's why Michelle didn't see the phone in the bedroom, because it wasn't there. It was in the office. It would be reasonable for her to not even think about it or to assume that Fotis had his phone. I don't think we ever heard who else was in the office that morning. And why would Michelle run back and forth to the office to manipulate Fotis's phone? And by the way, the expert testified that a number of those events could have been done by the phone itself or by an app. Anyway, why would the phone have to be in the office at all? If Michelle was supposed to manipulate the phone, why not just leave it in the bedroom or the kitchen instead of making her run back and forth to the office? And I've asked this before, and I'm going to ask it again right now. If Fotis wanted Michelle to make it look like he was there, why not make sure she has a conversation with Andreas so that it's more than a 17-second call? Why not have her respond to texts pretending to be Fotis? No one would have known that it wasn't Fotis. For the tampering charges, the prosecution has to prove that there was an agreement between Michelle and Fotis to get rid of evidence. They have to prove that Michelle knew it was evidence that they were tampering with, and that there was a pending investigation, and that in destroying the evidence, there was an intent to deceive. They have Michelle sitting in the passenger seat while Fotis throws out garbage. They allege that Michelle opening her door was intentional to block the view of the driver of another vehicle so that Fotis could throw that envelope down the sewer. They say it was perfectly timed, but there are some flaws here. The perfect timing was not perfect at all. They each opened their doors at the same time, yes, but Fotis didn't go straight to the sewer at that point. Also, the door doesn't actually obstruct the view of Fotis's hand putting something down the sewer. The door doesn't go that far down. And it's weird that they would be concerned about that one car and not all the other vehicles and pedestrians who were also present. And you'll notice that when Fotis puts the envelope in the sewer, it almost looks like an afterthought. Like he'd noticed the opportunity and quickly went and shoved it in there. Could one make themselves believe that this was carefully orchestrated? I suppose. And the prosecution can argue whatever they want. I guess I expected something better. They didn't present any argument that shows Michelle knew there was evidence of a crime in any of the bags or in that envelope. At this time of day, when Fotis was dumping garbage, Michelle hadn't found out yet that Jennifer was missing. So she didn't even know yet that there was a crime and that there might be evidence. The prosecution talked about motive, pointing to the fact that Michelle told police that the divorce proceedings were 2 years of torture. If Michelle was so sly, why on earth would she tell the police that? Normally, we see offenders engage in impression management. Heck, even truthful witnesses do that. We see offenders say, "Oh, I'm so nice and I'm a wonderful person and this is the kind of person I am. I'm just lovely and wonderful. And I would never get angry. Oh no, not me." So why wouldn't Michelle have said exactly the opposite of what she did say? Why hand the police what they call a motive on a silver platter? Because Michelle didn't see it as motive. That's why. She was just telling the truth. Of course it was awful. She said she didn't understand people acting like this. Michelle did quote herself at a different point as saying, "You people are toxic," a quote that the prosecution is now using against her and which, by the way, is being presented out of context. The "you people" Michelle was referring to were actually Fotis and Kent. If her statement points to motive, then by this logic, you'd have to say she planned to kill Fotis and Kent. I should point out, though, that the state does not actually have to prove motive. People commit crimes for reasons that are not apparent to others. That doesn't mean they didn't commit the crime. This applies in the reverse too, though. Motive and intent are two different things. A lot of people might have motive to commit a crime, but never form intent and never actually commit a crime. And the motive suggested here is based on a stereotype. We've already seen that Michelle's response to being pushed to her limit by Fotis is to leave. "You're crazy. I'm out of here. I don't want anything to do with this." Did her whole psychology suddenly change to make her willing to immerse herself in the very craziness and toxicity that so repulsed her that she wanted to say, "I'm out of here" over? And here's the thing about stereotypes. They're easy. They're familiar. Looking deeper or even catching the fact that you're going along with the stereotype in the first place can be hard. The prosecutor pointed out that when the police came to the door the night of May 24th, Michelle stayed upstairs. It's relevant to note also that Michelle's daughter was at school at a play at the time. Personally, I would have gone to the door to see what the heck is going on. Now, my first thought for me wouldn't have been, "Gee, is my kid okay?" Because I would have assumed, well, he's at his play, so he's fine. And I suspect that a lot of people out there listening would have a similar response as me. Well, you'd want to go see what's going on. Why are the police at my door? But I made this very mistake early in my coverage of this trial. So I'm going to try to not make that same mistake again. My mistake was that I was looking through my lens, not the lens of the other person. The prosecution's point here is one I think a lot of people can relate to, and it is a reasonable question. There's a reasonable answer that would favor the prosecution, and there are a number of reasonable answers that would favor the defense. There are more arguments from the prosecution later, and I think their final presentation could sway the jury. And we'll get to that. The defense had his turn to speak. The defense said Michelle did not know. She did not know anybody had a plan to kill Jennifer. Michelle believed things were looking up when it came to the family court issues. It's critical here to focus on what Michelle believed. Maybe Fotis was lying about how court was going, maybe he wasn't, but in some ways it doesn't matter. What matters is what Michelle believed. And she believed things were looking better. The defense agreed that Jennifer is deceased. He said that the state didn't really prove who did the actual killing and who else was involved in transporting Jennifer, but that whoever it was, ultimately it was Fotis's responsibility. I know why he's saying it this way, but based on the evidence, I still think the state has proven that Fotis actually killed Jennifer. The state has to prove that Michelle had intent on or before May 24th. The defense pointed out that the state has to prove that Michelle knew what was in the bags that Fotis threw out, and they presented no evidence that she knew. And they'd have to prove she knew it was evidence and that her intention was to help Fotis get rid of that evidence. They have not shown that. The defense pointed out that Michelle didn't even think Fotis was capable of such a thing. He went into what Michelle did know, and what Michelle knew, the Fotis she knew, was a different man. How many of you can relate to that? Believing you know someone and finding out later the person wasn't who you thought they were? Back to what Michelle knew or thought she knew. She met Fotis in 2016 and believed he was in the process of an amicable divorce. I've been wondering about this one. People are quick to judge the other woman, but have no idea what crap the man has fed her. Michelle fell in love with who she believed Fotis was. The defense pointed out that Fotis hid a lot of things from Michelle, just like he hid a lot of things from everybody else. We all saw evidence of this early on in this trial. Fotis was a practiced liar and manipulator, and he was good at hiding things. The defense pointed out that Lauren, the nanny, saw Fotis as a mentor. Lauren said that when Jennifer told her she thought Fotis was having an affair, Lauren didn't believe her. When asked in court why she didn't believe Jennifer, Lauren said Fotis wasn't that kind of man. She just couldn't believe he could do that. Even the nanny, who was close to Jennifer, didn't believe Fotis was capable of cheating. Do you think that while Fotis is wearing his mask, that anyone thinks he's capable of murder? We know that Fotis slipped up, and the nanny caught a glimpse of what was under Fotis's mask, and she changed her mind about him. But for a long time, Lauren also believed that Fotis was this great guy and not capable of infidelity, let alone a horrendous crime. Fotis made everyone believe that everything was fine. He made everyone believe that the family court stuff was going to be resolved in his favor. The defense pointed out that Pavel saw Fotis every day or almost every day for years. Pavel was around before Michelle. Yet when Fotis said and did things that were big red flags, Pavel went along with Fotis anyway. Fotis told Pavel to call the seats hardware. He washed his Tacoma. He had Pavel running around trying to replace seats. Huge red flags. Yet Pavel did all these things anyway. Pavel knew much more than Michelle did. Yet even with immunity and all this knowledge, Pavel said he didn't believe Fotis would commit this kind of a crime. Does that mean Fotis didn't commit the crime? No, it doesn't mean that. One could argue about Pavel's potential involvement, but that's a different conversation for a different day. The point is that even with all the red flags, Pavel still believed Fotis wasn't capable of this, and if everybody else including people who knew a lot more than Michelle, didn't put the pieces together, why should there be an exceptional expectation that Michelle would put it together? The defense claimed that there was no violence in Fotis' relationship with Jennifer. This got my hackles up. He freaking chased her through the house. Jennifer was running away from him, and he's chasing her, yelling at her. And this is what was witnessed. This guy was abusive. There's no question. And that no one witnessed a physical assault doesn't mean it never happened. And the absence of a conviction or a police report doesn't mean it didn't happen. There are a lot of DV homicides that end up in court where there's no record or report or witness statement indicating any previous violence. The absence of this is not any proof that the offender wouldn't have or couldn't have done this. I've heard this argument before, and it drives me around the bend every time. It's so full of misconception and supposition that by the time I could unpack that, the airlines would have found the defense's lost luggage. I understand why he's saying this stuff, but seriously, I wish he would have saved his breath and his time and his focus for other points. Okay, I'll calm down now and move on. The defense pointed out that Fotis wanted to hide his conversations about the divorce from Michelle. What do you want to bet? That it's because he was lying to Michelle about certain things and didn't want her to be able to figure it out if she overheard him talking. It's just another thing on the long list of things that Fotis hid. Yet another example of how Fotis deceived. This guy's whole persona was a lie. The devil doesn't tell you he's the devil. The defense pointed out that everyone, including lawyers, the children's guardian, professionals, all believed things were going well between Jennifer and Fotis. You know I talked about this in a different video. And all these professionals thought there was a light at the end of the tunnel in respect to the family court issues. The defense asks, why then would Michelle, because remember, what's in Michelle's mind is what matters here. Okay, so she's believing this. So why then, at this time, would she suddenly decide to risk everything and enter into a conspiracy to commit murder? It makes no sense. Well, you already know what I think of this in respect to Fotis, but Michelle is a different story. What Michelle believed matters a great deal. And believing that things were looking up, the defense is right. It doesn't make sense to risk everything dear to her to commit a horrendous crime when things are just turning around to the positive. Within a month of being accused of the crime, another woman moved in with Fotis. How much of a charmer do you have to be to convince a new partner to take up residence with you while you're being accused of murdering your former partner? This also makes me wonder how long the relationship with that woman, this Anna, how long had that been going on without Michelle knowing? The defense said that we all have people we trust and believe in, and we think they are who they say they are. And even when something looks weird or off, we don't automatically stop trusting them or jump to some horrific conclusion. I agree this is true. And anyone out there who thinks about it knows this is true. I've watched people struggle with this very thing. Watched them struggle to accept that their loved one did something bad. How many times have you heard, but he was such a nice guy? Or, oh, this is so out of character for him. There are violent serial offenders out there who have spouses and kids and family and friends, and none of them know a thing. And even after it's proven that their loved one did the thing, they still struggle. And they even struggle when they're the victim. of the loved one. They search for reasons why. It boggles their minds, twists them inside out, challenges their entire world view. And whether the light bulb flicks on quickly or the truth slowly dawns on them one ray at a time, there's still a need to deny and a whole other head trip. How could I be so stupid? How could I love someone who could do such a thing? I could go on, but I think you get the idea. The bottom line is that Michelle didn't know anything before Bowman sat her down and showed her evidence. The defense made a statement about Fotis that I think is a true statement, and it can apply to a lot of offenders. He said Fotis's behavior was not for or because of Michelle. I agree. Whether you're talking about the crime itself or any number of other things that Fotis did, Fotis's behavior was for Fotis. Fotis's behavior was because of who he was and because of what he wanted. Then the defense brought up the DNA in Jennifer's house. The freaking cake box theory. He didn't push it like it looked like he might in the beginning, but he still alluded to transfer DNA. Cracker Jacks, man. I'm sorry. That's my opinion. Yeah, I know there's transfer DNA. But we're talking about Fotis's DNA inside the house on a high-touch surface that gets cleaned regularly days after he had been there. Like, I'm sorry, it's just Cracker Jacks. The defense did say, well, you think Fotis took off his gloves to wash up and then left his DNA there and then put his bloody gloves back on? Just like the prosecution can make an argument that makes sense if you're only looking at the argument, he's speculating. Just like the prosecution is speculating about what happened or what may have happened or what people thought, the defense is speculating. So it's all Cracker Jacks. And moving on, the defense pointed out that Pavel said that Jennifer had been in the Tacoma before. He said Jennifer's DNA was found in the foam. He pointed out that if there was blood in that foam, there would have been a stain even if it had been cleaned. Here's a little something I learned from my CSI friend. People will try to shampoo carpet and upholstery to get rid of evidence, but what they don't realize is that this often pushes the evidence deeper into the carpet or the upholstery. Anyway, the presence of DNA does not mean blood. It could have been saliva. DNA exposed to the elements, to sunlight, to chemicals, will become degraded or destroyed. DNA can stay on a thing for years if it's in the right environment. But I didn't hear the defense ask the DNA expert a hypothetical on this specific environment, meaning the foam. So the foam is covered, not exposed to the elements and all of that. He never asked that hypothetical specifically, or maybe they did and I just missed it. I did notice that during the trial, there was so much focus on touch DNA that they didn't address saliva. The location on that seat is consistent with a possible saliva deposit. That would seep into the foam and be harder to remove. Even if there's an argument for why Jennifer's DNA would be in Pavel's truck so long after she'd voluntarily been in the truck, you'd have to explain to me how and why it survived all this time in order for me to give the argument much weight. You have to consider the weight to give each argument. Yes, I know the defense does not have to prove anything. Note also that Jennifer's DNA was not found in any other vehicles. if Fotis was really engaging in some huge bloody crime cleanup at 80 Mountain Spring, why was there nothing found in his other vehicles or in any of the houses? The chimney. The defense pointed out it was a motion-activated camera, so it's not catching every second of smoke. He said it was a windy day, and the house was on a mountain, so it was the kind of day for a fire. He said that Pavel had said he helped her bring firewood to the house, and it was normal for Michelle to have fires frequently. I was surprised that that's where he went with the wind argument. And I was surprised he wasn't more forceful about this. I think he was needing to rush through things because all that he wanted to say required more time than he had. Let's talk about this fire thing a little more. If having a fire was an everyday or regular kind of thing for Michelle, then she wouldn't think to say anything about it. I've talked about this before. She'd be focusing on details that would show where she was rather than on mundane things. And it would be no surprise to get the time wrong on that. It's common for people to get times wrong. I couldn't tell you what time I had lunch on any given day, including today. The combination of the wind with a motion-activated camera. Let's talk about that. If the camera is activated at a moment when the wind is blowing that smoke away from the chimney top, you're not going to see the smoke. What you're seeing is not the absence of fire, but the absence of smoke because it's windy. And the wind is not going to be consistently blowing the smoke away. It will be intermittent. The police failed to check Michelle's story on this. They did not interview the mother about this, or if they did, they didn't tell anybody about it, and if that happened, that's a whole other ball of wax. They didn't ask Pavel about carrying the firewood, and even after Pavel said he carried up the firewood, everybody ignored that. The lead detective didn't bother to look at footage from any other days to see if what Michelle said about regularly having fires was true. Neither the state nor the police sought information on how materials burn and what color the smoke might be if she was burning one material versus wood. Remember, it's the state's burden to prove that something happened here. Despite it being the state's burden to prove that having a fire meant anything beyond having a fire, they chose not to offer actual evidence or even seek that evidence. Instead, they went with innuendo and relied on people's imaginations to do the job for them. And if the jury is to imagine or surmise that Michelle was burning evidence, what is it exactly they're supposed to surmise that she was burning? You can't get rid of a person in the fireplace. So what was she burning? What color smoke does that imaginary thing that she's burning produce when it's burned? And why do you suppose they want the jury to imagine? The evidence shows that Michelle had a wood-burning fire in the fireplace just like she frequently does. That's it. That's all that evidence shows. The defense moved on to the Suburban, and he raised a question that has been nagging at me. Where was Jennifer's Suburban? Video shows the Tacoma on Lapham Road in the morning. Jennifer's Suburban was found around 8 o'clock that night. In between those times, there was no video of that Suburban earlier than 8 p.m. There were no witnesses who saw it earlier. Where was it? I have thoughts on this one, but I'll save them for my video I'm going to do on unanswered questions in this case, because there are a lot of unanswered questions. The defense pointed out that the police found nothing at 80 Mountain Springs except that empty coffee cup, which supports Michelle's statement. The defense pointed out how the police scared Michelle, threatened her with losing her daughter. But Michelle just didn't know. She had no way to save herself because she didn't know anything. People have asked me, why do you think Michelle didn't take a deal? Why wouldn't she just tell them where Jennifer is and maybe get a lighter sentence? That tells me that the people asking those questions have already assumed she's guilty. They're assuming that she knows. And there is no presumption of innocence in their minds. Michelle can't make a deal if she has nothing to make a deal with. She can't make a deal any more than you could go to the grocery store and fill up your cart with stuff and walk out without exchanging something for it, like your cash or credit card. If Michelle has nothing to deal with, she can't make a deal. If she doesn't know, she doesn't know. And if people are starting with the presumption of guilt, the assumption that she knows, instead of the presumption of innocence, well, they'll be mad because she didn't make a deal or tell where Jennifer was. Have you ever seen a movie where the bad guy is either torturing or threatening someone and saying, "Tell us or else"? Am I the only one who's ever watched one of these things and wondered, geez, what happens if the guy really doesn't know or really doesn't have the thing? This is one of those situations, except it's real. The defense pointed out that Michelle had traveled the world, competed in sports internationally, and wanted to continue to travel and compete. There was no evidence that she wanted to suddenly become the stay-at-home mother to 6 kids. That's what Fotis wanted, not what Michelle wanted. The defense pointed out that it wasn't until Jacob was telling Fotis he needed to do a timeline that Michelle learned that Fotis had been at Jennifer's house the previous Wednesday. The prosecution had suggested that Fotis showing up early that previous Wednesday was part of a conspiracy. Well, how does Michelle conspire retroactively? Does she have a time machine? The defense started to say, if you give any credit to Pavel's statement that Michelle made a disparaging remark about Jennifer, and then he pointed out that Pavel was told he could be deported. The point here is that Pavel would have big reason to tell the state whatever they wanted to hear. And there's something I want to point out here, and that's that Pavel said Michelle made this statement while he was carrying firewood for her. The firewood was not a central point to Pavel's statement, not the focus, so he's just told them, without realizing it, that he does bring up firewood for Michelle. And the defense returned to the remark Pavel said Michelle made after Jennifer's disappearance, when Michelle was upset about her daughter's picture being plastered all over the place. Michelle allegedly said, "When she shows up, I'm going to kill her." When she shows up. If Michelle believes Jennifer is dead, why does she say when she shows up? And if Michelle believes Jennifer was murdered, why on earth would she say I'm going to kill her? There are a lot of reasons for her to not say that, including that it would look bad for her. The defense pointed out that Pavel agreed. That is, that Pavel also thought Jennifer was going to turn up. Pavel, who has seen and heard more than Michelle, Pavel, who knows Jennifer, Pavel, who has seen things that most of us on the outside looking in see as red flags, Pavel thinks Jennifer is going to show up. The defense said the state has not proven Fotis was in New Canaan. Excuse me, my eyeballs just fell out. I know why he's saying this, and yes, one really could argue this, but I'm sorry. There's too much evidence saying Fotis did this. If you think Fotis was not in New Canaan, you can put whatever argument for that position you want in the comments. I won't argue with anybody about it. I'm not going to go on about it here. The defense brought up the vehicles on Lapham Road and asked a question. The Tacoma was parked about 300 yards from where the Suburban was found. He asked how one could transport a body or a seriously injured woman from one vehicle to the other. 300 yards on a road where there are other cars during daylight hours. Well, I'll tell you, Mr. Schoenhorn, you don't. Jennifer was not moved there. But Schoenhorn knows this. It's just that it seems no one else with responsibility has asked this question and looked into it. The issue of where she was moved to is another one of those questions that's been bugging me. And I'll talk more about that in my video that I'm going to make on the unanswered questions. The defense brought up Jennifer's phone pairing with the Suburban at 2:56 p.m. He made it clear he is not suggesting that Jennifer was alive. He is not suggesting she was trying to use her phone. This is another one of these outstanding questions I want to talk about later. And here's another thing about that. Kimball knew this. Once again, he had information that he didn't follow up on. Information that didn't support his theory. So he ignored it, even after an expert emailed him about it. Is the goal to uncover the whole truth? Or is it simply to lock somebody up? The defense brought up that dogs tracked Jennifer's scent to the train tracks. He reiterated that he's not suggesting that Jennifer ran and jumped on a train, but somebody full of Jennifer's scent had been out in that area. Schoenhorn didn't say it, but I will. The prosecution ignored or glossed over a lot that was inconvenient, but didn't gloss over irrelevant information. They buried the jury in details that didn't matter, and these details that do matter got buried in that pile. They built the haystack around the needles. I noticed this throughout the whole trial, and I found it troubling. The defense talked briefly about how the science shows that being fed information can change a person's perception. He didn't talk specifically about how Michelle adopted Kimball's insistence about the window washing, but I think that one's a good example in this case. She had come to accept that she'd said she was washing windows, and she apologized for it, even though she was right and Kimball was wrong. He'd made her believe something that wasn't so. That being fed information changes your perception is well established. I would add that focusing on certain information while downplaying other information also changes a person's perception. Ask anyone in marketing or politics. They'll tell you. Stick a pin in this. It's going to come up again in a different way. The defense pointed out that Michelle didn't have to tell them a lot of what she told them. If she was trying to hinder an investigation, she could have simply not told them things, but she did. She didn't have to tell them that she picked up Fotis' phone in the office. They wouldn't have known that she'd done that if she hadn't told them. If that was part of some conspiracy, Why on earth would she volunteer that? And he raised a question. If the plan was for Michelle to answer Fotis's phone, then why did Kent need to be there? On the night of the 24th, Fotis stepped out to buy meat, and he took that opportunity to call Kent. If these people at this dinner party allegedly toasting Jennifer's impending demise were all in on a big conspiracy, then why does Fotis have to call Kent in secret? Hell, why not put him on speakerphone? Because the conspiracy was not with any of those people. The conspiracy was with Kent. He pointed out that it was Pavel and Fotis who took the Tacoma to 80 Mountain Spring, and Michelle had nothing to do with that. And Fotis and Pavel did that while Michelle was preoccupied with showing rugs, talking to guests, and preparing for a dinner party. I suggest that it's possible that Fotis wanted this dinner party to happen on this night because it would cause Michelle to be busy and preoccupied. Remember, he invited 2 sets of guests, and the one couple had the feeling that maybe he'd forgotten he'd invited them too. I could be wrong about this, but he's such a snake in the grass, so accustomed to setting things up so he can sneak around. The defense talked about how the police worked to convince Michelle she was wrong, even when they were the ones who were wrong. In his remarks, he gave Kimball a lot of grace and leeway and understanding. I wonder if there were things that he would have liked to have said but didn't. He also talked about the standards. He said it better than I can, so I'll play the clip. Pay particular attention to the idea of how credibility should be judged, the double standards at play, and what would happen to a regular citizen if they did what Kimball did.
She asked them what they wanted her to say, and maybe she was wrong. Even when she wasn't, even when she was helping and trying to be truthful, they told her she was wrong if that didn't fit their narrative. And eventually, for example, the FedEx envelope, she told them she knew nothing about these license plates. They told her, that doesn't matter. They cut her off and said, we don't need to know, that's not important. Well, it wasn't important until what? Today, when you hear the state again talk about 2024, how important that was. They didn't even let her say what she wanted to say about that. Sometimes they were mistaken, sort of like the 30 stops when it was only 3. You heard Kimball admit that was a mistake. He admitted a few times in answering questions, especially by Mr. McGinnis, those were mistakes. But the difference is those mistakes were under oath. He swore to some of these things. He couldn't remember who told him that. He didn't have any documentation. But when he swears to something under oath, if a private person does that, they'd probably get arrested and charged with perjury or false statement. For him, it's just a mistake. For Michelle, if she makes a mistake or misspeaks, it's a crime. That's the distinction that they're trying to make here.
The defense pointed out the fact that Pavel was in New Canaan on the 24th, and his location was a mystery. He'd left his job site and never went back, and no one knows where he was. And it was during that period of time when Jennifer's phone paired with her Suburban. There is no video at all of the Raptor going from New Canaan to Farmington. They know Pavel stopped at a gas station, and they know he arrived at 80 Mountain Springs. The phone pairing at 2:56 and when and where Pavel was next seen is enough time to get from New Canaan to where he was seen. The defense didn't bring it up here, but this is a good place to remind everybody that when Pavel was stopped by police and asked where he was coming from, he lied. He told the police about where he was hours before, instead of telling them what he'd really been doing, which was running around looking to replace seats and then removing seats from a Porsche. How can anyone not wonder what else he left out? What he left out of his claims about where he was on the 24th when no one knew where he was. Pavel, who was told by Fotis he needed to make a timeline, and Pavel, who said he didn't need a timeline because he would remember, but even just days afterward, he couldn't remember. The defense pointed out how Pavel deleted from his phone searches for a new Tacoma. He deleted his search history that showed his searches for information on Jennifer's disappearance. In fact, he deleted everything on his phone for the entire weekend of the 24th. Now, why would you do that? The defense didn't point it out, but I will. There was no evidence of any deleted history on Michelle's phone. The defense pointed out the lack of nexus between Michelle and Kent. The defense pointed out that the texts between Andreas and Fotis that the jury saw were not the actual texts, but translations. The original messages were in Greek. Michelle does not speak Greek, by the way. The defense didn't point it out, but I will. Even the translation included at the normal, which suggests that Fotis was telling Andreas to call at the normal time. We already know what a devious, sneaky guy Fotis is. We know he sets up situations and people in ways that allow him to hide and sneak around. I suggest that the people he uses have no idea they're being used. If people knew he was using them like this, not very many would stick around. It could very well be that Fotis, knowing that Andreas called at a usual time, was taking advantage of that and would have Kent answer the phone. He brought up the realtor. It was proven that there was in fact a showing of 80 Mountain Springs on May 25th. And if you'll recall, that wasn't even scheduled until May 24th. The defense asked why Fotis would agree to show that property if he was using it as a staging ground for a horrendous crime cleanup. He posed the question of why, if Michelle was burning things, would she not burn the damning things? Things that could have been burned and were not. He reminded the jury that the police searched the houses, including Fort Jefferson. They brought in cadaver dogs, and even the dogs picked up nothing. The Tacoma keys. He pointed out that when she was told that she had the keys and that Pavel wanted them, she returned them immediately. If she'd wanted to keep the keys from him, all she'd have to do is say, I don't have them. Then the defense gives what should be the knockout. But I think it won't end up that way. But I'll get to that. During Michelle's second interview, the state's attorney was there. Even the state's attorney believed Michelle didn't know. Michelle was not part of Fotis's conspiracy. And that shows reasonable doubt. Because the state has the burden of proof, they get to speak again to try to rebut everything the defense said. The first thing they did was play to emotion. Everybody knows that the jury is not supposed to make decisions based on emotion. It's even in the charge to the jury. But we all also know that juries are comprised of human beings. And no one with an ounce of humanity can fail to care that 5 children lost their mom. That what happened to Jennifer is horrendous. That Jennifer's mom has lost her girl. How could anybody not care about that? How do you not feel something? So now the jurors are full of emotion and all the chemical processes that come with that. I think that's important. It does affect your thinking. As we go through this, I'm going to make a distinction between the prosecution's arguments and the presentation. When I point out flaws in the arguments, I'm talking only about the arguments and not how powerful the presentation is. I think the way that McGinnis presented his arguments will have a powerful effect on jurors, and the manner of his presentation will sway people. The prosecutor said the jury didn't hear much from the defense about the Hartford dump. Well, yeah, because there was not much to say about it. And that's the point. She didn't know what was in the bags. He said Michelle's motive was that she hated Jennifer. Remember, the prosecution does not have to be balanced. He can point to the evidence of animus and ignore things like how Michelle wanted Fotis to help look for Jennifer, or how it was Michelle offering to help the police look for Jennifer, or how Michelle couldn't understand why Fotis and Jennifer had to fight the way they did, or how Michelle offered to have coffee with Jennifer and work out whatever Jennifer's concerns were. The prosecutor does not have to say any of that. The prosecutor said the defense would have you believe that things were going well, but really they weren't. He pointed out that Michelle thought Jennifer was manipulating Fotis, and Michelle told Fotis to stick to the courts. She's manipulating you. There are two pieces to this I want to look at. First, Michelle did express that she was suspicious and thought maybe Jennifer was playing some kind of a game. Given everything that Fotis had told Michelle about Jennifer, and that this sudden pleasantness was a big change in behavior, to be suspicious is reasonable. The trouble is that Michelle was suspicious of the wrong person. She noticed the change in behavior that didn't make sense, but didn't recognize that the problem, the threat, was coming from Fotis, not Jennifer. The second piece of this is her telling Fotis to stick to the courts. Those of you who have followed me for a while may recall I've talked about this subject before in the context of threat assessment. When a subject's response is to use legal means to get what they want, and I mean legal means like a request, court, a formal complaint, etc., that's a good sign. It's when they either exhaust those means or decide to use different means that you need to worry and reassess. Even in Michelle's suspicion and uneasiness in this situation, her solution is to stick to the courts. There is one heck of a leap from sticking to the courts to conspiracy to murder. If anything, Michelle was pushing Fotis away from the road that would lead to that ultimate crime. But Fotis had already made up his mind. Court was not working for him at the time that he made up his mind. The big behavioral changes with Jennifer happened after Fotis was resolved, and Michelle saying stick to the courts wasn't going to suddenly sway him. He already had his plan. He'd already had Pavel fix the bicycle. He'd been talking to Kent a lot. He'd been getting up very early in the morning. He'd already stalked and surveilled. It was already in motion by the time Michelle said this. Michelle saw something was different, but she misunderstood what that meant. She misattributed because she didn't have all the information and she'd been fed lies. McGinnis pushed the state's theory that Michelle's timeline was an alibi script. I've already talked a lot about this, so I won't go over it all again. Certainly, Fotis wanted to control everybody's perceptions and everybody's narratives. But Fotis and Michelle and Pavel are three different people. Michelle's timeline was not a script, but that's the state's theory. and they put that into the jurors' minds. McGinnis said that Michelle lied repeatedly. Remember I told you to stick a pin in the fact that people's perceptions will change when they're fed information, and how focusing on one thing and then ignoring something else can change perception? It's time to keep that in mind now. He played a clip of Michelle saying Fotis's phone wasn't there. Here's the thing. He played it out of context. They were asking her if she saw the phone in the bedroom. She said she did not. She didn't see it in the bedroom because it wasn't there, because Fotis put it in the office so it would be available to Kent. But of course she didn't know any of that. She was telling the truth. But the way this is played out of context, it looks like a lie. Let's talk about presentation. They played her words out of context, so it appears to be a lie. I'm telling you, I think that because of the way this was presented, the jury is going to believe it was a lie. McGinnis went through other clips in the same way, doing the same thing. They did this through the whole trial. This is not about the truth. This is about winning. A woman's life is on the line, and yet another child is going to lose her mother. And questions about what happened to Jennifer will continue to go unanswered. But there's even more at stake here, as if that wasn't enough. McGinnis said that Dr. Loftus didn't point to one thing that the police fed Michelle. That's correct. And why did she not point to anything? Because that's not what she was hired to do. The defense did, however, point to many things that the police fed Michelle, even force-fed Michelle. And the jurors, being given the information about how this works, could apply that information and see for themselves just how much the police fed to Michelle, and that Fotis fed Michelle, and that Michelle assumed that she was the one who was wrong. But now what's being fed to the jury is a misdirect. Now what's in the jurors' minds is, oh yeah, the expert didn't point to anything in the interview. So, yet again, the argument by itself is BS. But the presentation? Oh, the presentation is masterful, if the goal is to sway. McGinnis said Michelle told details that didn't matter but forgot details that did matter. He's leaving out how they stopped her from giving details when she was trying to give them, how she asked them what it was they wanted, how she expressed confusion about what details she should give and which ones they thought were stupid. McGinnis is leaving out all the details that did matter that she did tell police. He's leaving out how much she told them that helped them in their investigation, things she didn't have to tell them. He's leaving out that she gave details that made her look bad and that might get her in trouble. McGinnis is leaving out important details right here. But that's not what the jurors are thinking. They're focusing on the specific point McGinnis is feeding them. McGinnis said that Michelle doubled down on her lies, that she told the police Fotis was there, and then he wasn't, and then he was. But that's not what happened. That is not what she said. She was explaining to police why she thought Fotis was there. She was explaining why she'd originally said he was there, which is that she believed he was there, she'd seen the Suburban, she'd seen Kent. She was not returning to a former story at all. But back to presentation. You present something out of context, and it can suddenly look like something else. His argument is absolutely wrong, but it doesn't matter because he's playing with the minds of the jurors and watering the seeds he'd planted previously, and he's planting more seeds. Doesn't matter that those seeds are weeds. They're gonna grow. He did this over and over and over. Play a clip out of context, mischaracterize it, ignore inconvenient facts, refocus attention, repeat, repeat, repeat. Jurors will be swayed by this. The public will be swayed by this. His arguments are garbage, but his presentation utilizes multiple powerful tools. Then McGinnis did something that could sway someone like me. I mean, he really covered the psychological basis. He listed what he called coincidences, and he put his points on the screen one by one. So the jury is both hearing and seeing each point. So it's all more likely to stick in their minds. Is this a coincidence? Is that a coincidence? What about this? You think that's a coincidence? Point after point after point. And the reason I say this could sway someone like me is that when I see coincidences, I get suspicious. I start questioning things. I don't just accept that they're coincidences, and the more there are, the more I question everything. And here's an example of the difference between using a heuristic and stopping to delve into possible questions. If you say, uh-oh, too many coincidences, therefore it means this, whether it's about this case or not, you've missed a whole lot. You know my catchphrase is trust your gut. And I've talked before about how your gut tells you, hey, there's something here you need to pay attention to. Some people get that gut feeling and don't actually examine what underlies it. And people apply rules or something that they think is a rule without examination. Too many coincidences is a big neon sign that says, hey, ask questions, delve deeper. So what do we find when we delve into the prosecution's long, alarming list of coincidences? We find that it's all in the presentation. Things are presented out of context. Things are conflated, mischaracterized. Connections between things that don't exist are created and presented as something else. An idea is repeated. A mischaracterization is repeated. McGinnis is a doctor who quietly put the jury on a psychological IV that drips constantly. And now that there's a risk that the patient will wake up, he's increased the rate of the drip. If you're still here, thank you for sticking with me. Throw a hello or a you're welcome in the comments to let me know that you made it this far. I'm going to answer 3 questions a lot of people have been asking me. Do I think the state has proven the charges against Michelle beyond a reasonable doubt? My answer is no. They haven't even come close. But that brings us to another question. And that's the question of what the jury thinks and why. Based on the facts, based on the evidence, the state hasn't proved their case. But swaying the jury is a different thing. Someone commented on one of my earlier videos that she thought there wasn't enough evidence, but that the jury would convict anyway. Everything in me wanted to say, no, this is wrong, except the person who made the comment was not wrong. She's realistic. Convicting someone based on anything other than the evidence is wrong, but it happens all the time. And I think the person who commented is correct. I think there is a strong possibility Michelle will be convicted, not because of the evidence, but in spite of it. And that's scary. And the last question. Failing to prove something beyond a reasonable doubt is different from innocent or actually not guilty. Do I think Michelle is actually guilty? No. I believe she really didn't know. Trust your gut. I'll see you in the comments.